Right, I can see a couple more people filtering in. I'm sure we've got more to join. There's a lot of people signed up for this today. So first of all, welcome everyone to our session. I'm Sammy Andrews. I'm going to be hosting today, and AIM are presenting their artist growth model. And we have some incredible experts who have modeled this out. Will and David are going to be talking us through some of the work that they've done, really getting into the numbers around this. And Paul is going to explain a little bit about why AIM have done this, and then we're going to have a debate conversation, a really respectful conversation, I hope, around all of the options, the challenges, and we're opening this up to questions. Everyone here today can ask questions. If you want to ask questions, pop them in the Q&A. We're going to, if there's any, I'll keep an eye on it during the chat. If there's any that we think we should answer during, I'll try and pull them out, but please bear in mind there are a lot of you on the call today. I'm not going to be able to get around to every question, but I will try and do as many as possible. We're going to leave some time at the end, probably 15, 20 minutes to actually just go through Q&A, but throw them in the question window as we go, please. And I'm going to throw over now to Paul Pacifico, CEO of AIM, to fully introduce what we're talking about today.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sammy, and thanks everyone for coming along to attend this session. So we're going to talk about our approach to how to fix streaming. We all know there's a lot of debate right now about how the streaming economy currently works. There are lots of calls to fix streaming, with some proposals having been put forward by various industry campaign groups like Broken Record and Fix Streaming. But before we get into it, I just wanted to take a moment to state clearly the intentions for the session today, what we're hoping to achieve, and equally important to state what this session is not. The music industry, and even more so the streaming economy, is a complex network of interrelated interests with multiple stakeholder groups who all either earn a bigger or a smaller share of the pie, depending on how the system is altered. Importantly, that view presupposes that we're playing a zero-sum game, fighting over individual shares of a fixed pool of revenue. And this is where the points of difference in the different stakeholder groups become most evident. We argue in turn about whether the platform's margin is too big, whether the label or the publisher share is fair, and whether creators are sufficiently rewarded for their endeavors. Where I think we're all aligned is in our passion for music and our desire to see its potential fully realized, both in terms of its cultural impact and commercial value. We can see from industry data that music usage has increased massively, but that the commercial return to the industry is still less than what it was at the height of the CD boom. When adjusted for inflation, the industry is still way smaller than it once was. I would say that suggests room for continued growth and the opportunity to work together to maximize music's opportunity in the growing attention economy. The new digital world is different from the old one. I think we recognize that, and some of the complaints we hear from across the industry, including from within the AIM community, are from people trying to figure out whether the new world works for them, how things have changed, and what the impact is. I think it's essential to recognize that the digital market has democratized access, so there are many more people in the industry than ever before. And that's great for cultural diversity and opportunities to get into music without relying on a handful of gatekeepers. But it presents challenges on the other hand around how to make a living from a smaller pie with many more people sharing smaller slices. A compounding issue is that the streaming market is a winner-takes-all space in which 80% of the revenue goes to just around 1% of the participants. But let's come back to that in a moment. First, I'd like to introduce myself and AIM, as I know we have people joining us from all areas of the creative economy, academia, government, and colleagues from all over the world. I came to AIM not as a public policy or government affairs expert, but as an artist and session musician who grew a successful independent music business and who has experienced making a living from music from many different sides of the table. People I meet in the industry these days see me as some kind of executive, which I have become, but they don't know me as the van-driving, PA-lugging, music-playing artist and grafter that dragged myself through the industry to get here by my bootstraps. I still perform and record and love it. I see the creative and commercial sides of the business as much more aligned than they were in the old world, and that's a strength we're only just starting to capitalize on. I was recently awarded the rank of Associate Professor, teaching the artist as a startup at Berklee College of Music's Master's Campus in Valencia, Spain. And I hold my own experiences and those that I learn from AIM members closely as I help guide the next generation of international artists there through the complex world of making it in music on their own terms. In terms of AIM, we are the not-for-profit trade association representing the independent music community in the UK. In the old world, that meant indie labels, but the contemporary reality is quite different. Our community is the constellation of small businesses in music, from self-releasing artists and independent labels to music distributors and other related service businesses. All of our members are building businesses based on recorded music in some way. And many are also music publishers and managers and have interests in live music as well. Ours is a broad and diverse community of over 1,000 members across every genre, and together our sector represents over 25% of the UK's recorded music market. This year, we have further expanded our offering and opened up a free tier of membership to help in our mission to level the playing field and offer access to the knowledge and networks necessary to play the music game and win. This new associate membership is now up and running and on the way to hitting our target of onboarding 100,000 self-releasing artists and other music entrepreneurs over the next 12 months. So these are exciting but challenging times, and there's a lot to discuss. My hope is that today's session provides a platform for healthy, respectful, and constructive discussion that helps us all develop our thinking and assess our options in the debates about the future music economy. I also hope it helps reset some of the adversarial encounters that have characterized some of the engagement that's taken place in the past and fosters a new opportunity to create safe spaces for these crucial conversations to take place. This session is not some kind of pull back the curtain reveal of a solution that solves everyone's problems with streaming. In fact, we do not believe there is one solution that fixes everything. Indeed, there are some who don't believe the current model is broken at all. The independent community itself reflects this diversity of thought and perspective, as evidenced by the Impala 10-point plan to make streaming work. We're looking at a complex mix of a number of cross-cutting issues, and the artist growth model is a response to one of those that we feel is crucial. That's not to say that other proposals are right or wrong, just to acknowledge that each proposal seeks to solve a specific problem, and that rearranges a different set of winners and losers accordingly. I think we need to be honest and transparent about the problem we identify, the solution we're exploring, and the impact in terms of potential winners and losers from that outcome. This does not get around some of the other key issues, like unfair terms in contracts. AIM stands by the Win Fair Digital Deals Declaration that commits to both playing and paying fair in dealings with artists. Some of our members have been vocal in setting out their own specific vision of what fair means to them. And it was great to see Sony recently taking action on unrecouped balances. It's a positive step forward that should be rightly recognised. From my point of view, each deal needs to be assessed in its unique context, as every artist and every situation is individual. I think a good deal is the right deal for the right artist with the right partner at the right time and on the right terms. But for that to work, artists need to be well informed and well advised, with professional legal and management support and resources such as the new AIM Associate Knowledge Base. So I think we can all do better, AIM included, in how we address ourselves to these issues and to serve creators and serve our sector by taking responsibility, not just for proposals that benefit one narrow stakeholder group, but that strengthen the ecosystem as a whole, so that we can all benefit by having a thriving, diverse, and exciting creative music landscape long into the future that brings us together and escapes the zero-sum game. So I'm not here to bash the major labels. They play an important role in the ecosystem. I'm also not here to bash the platforms who are our partners. I also note that I've been characterized in the past as anti-user-centric, which I'm not. But pointing out reasons to be skeptical or critical has been reason enough for me to be labeled as such. I think there are important pros and cons to user-centric, which merit analysis and debate to assess their relative costs and benefits. And I'm always willing to engage politely and respectfully in those debates. Similarly, equitable remuneration. I'm not against artists and session musicians being fairly rewarded. On the contrary, I celebrate it. But there are costs and benefits to each of these proposals, and it's essential that we find the data necessary to analyze whether prioritizing one set of stakeholders has a disproportionately negative impact on the ecosystem as a whole, whether that's the major labels, independents, publishers, managers, artists, or writers. Back in 2015, I advocated for equitable remuneration during a speech in Brussels as part of the lobbying we were doing on the copyright directive when I was president of the International Artists Association. At the time, We didn't believe it was the right solution, but we didn't see any other option, as we realized that advocating for it gave us the strongest leverage possible in our fight for fairer deals with labels. We were very successful, and the landscape has changed since then. That year saw the publication of the original Fair Digital Deals Declaration, followed by commitments from all 3 major labels to share the proceeds from Spotify equity sales. My reservations about ER then are the same as the ones I'm still concerned about today. I believe better fixes for older deals lie in adjusting contracts to more contemporary terms to reflect the contemporary business. I also believe we need to recognize the contribution of session musicians on tracks that become successful. In fact, on that, we have presented a solution both to the BPI and to the Musicians Union that we think rewards success rather than pays for failure, and we hope to test that with them further soon. In short, my position comes not from a lack of sympathy or understanding of the challenges, but just the belief that there may be better ways to solve those problems. And so to today and the problem we identify, define, and try to solve with the artist growth model. I don't want to steal Will and David's thunder in presenting the model, but I would just like to frame how and why we came to this approach. I always feel that the music industry is a microcosm of wider society. The big themes that play out in the world somehow always also have an analog underway in the music industry, and streaming is no exception. As society debates the gig economy that squeezes out local businesses and small suppliers, we see politicians wrestling with the opposing forces of the ubiquitous accessibility of platform economies and their cost benefits to consumers, with support for pluralism and local diversity with their societal benefits to consumers. And so it is in music. In the streaming economy, those same forces are in play. And it's reported that 80% of revenues go to just 1% of the people in the market. But that's not to say that streaming is de facto unfair. Just that from an aim point of view, we believe it puts a sustainable living out of reach for all but the top few. And that doesn't align with our values of transparency, fairness, and diversity across both business and creativity. It means that the niche, credible artists and emerging talent that create the excitement, buzz, and longevity of interest in music are stuck in the middle. Big enough to need to focus full-time on their music, but not at big enough scale to make it work from streaming. The artist growth model is a bit of a Robin Hood. It shaves a small amount off the top and pushes it further down the curve. It still rewards success, but it also enables more and more diverse artists to participate in that success. Now, it's easy to say this will never work, as the major labels dominate the top 1% and they'll never allow their top earnings to be diluted. But I'm not so sure. The legendary artists that recently wrote to Boris Johnson spoke specifically of wanting to support the next generation, and this would do just that. It would also incentivize those labels to sign more diverse talent and would make each signing less risky. So what you lose off the top, you may very well gain back by supporting credible niche and new artists who drive new approaches, ideas, and sounds that will keep the music market innovative and dynamic, something that will benefit performers, writers, artists, and their commercial partners alike. It'll also support a much more diverse ecosystem in terms of choice of repertoire, which means the fans win as well. Thank you for coming today. I look forward to the discussion and debate and to your questions later on. I also look forward to following up with any of you that would like to do so after this session, to continue the conversation and to help contribute to the amazing opportunity we have together to evolve and improve our industry. Thank you. At this point, my turn to hand over to Will Page and David Safir, to whom I'm eternally grateful for their work in taking a sort of vague idea, channeling it, and putting some data to it so that we could push and pull it around, as I'm sure they're about to present. Guys, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you both. A wonderful introduction, passionate introduction from Paul, and I'm very grateful we have the best moderator in the business, Sammy, here to manage what's going to be the biggest bun fight of the year. So good luck, Sammy. So we will, every minute we are talking, you can't ask questions, and this is your time, not ours. We want to get through the material, but also offer to bring back old slides when we get into Q&A, and make sure you can squeeze us like sponges and get as much out of us during this next hour as possible. The presentation is called the Artist Growth Model, and we're going to show an application of progressive and therefore digressive scales. That's the basis for this presentation here. Now, in preparing Sammy for the bun fight that's going to follow, I thought, what is the hook for the Q&A? And this is a nod to my good friend Crispin Hunt, which is I promised to put the words ER into the slide deck, but the context matters. Not ER, equitable remuneration, but how can we put ER after the word fair? How do you make the model fairer? Full stop, here's Tom with the weather. That's the purpose of this presentation. And that's why I find myself aligned with Paul Pacifico's thinking. Start from a blank sheet of paper. The business is growing, artists are getting paid, streaming services are making money. Is it fair, and can we make it fairer? What tweaks, adjustments, nudges can we apply to the market to turn fair into fairer? That's the theme of this debate, and I'm open to all questions around this topic. We're going to discuss one solution. There are many others as well. To introduce us, I'll hand the mic to David Safir, the younger of both of us here, to introduce himself. David.
Hi, I'm obviously David Safir, and depending on which way you're looking at that photograph, you might want to enter a caption competition. I think the winner would probably be that Will is saying it's not fair, and I'm saying life isn't fair, Sonny. Anyway, that's all I really need to say, apart from the fact that you can see that I spent nearly 20 years as Vice President of International at ASCAP. I had some incredible mentors there. The best thing about them was that they were themselves songwriters and publishers. That's how I actually learned the business. But I came to it from two businesses which you may think were very different, but not really. One of them was program acquisition at the BBC, which is a very interesting infrastructure, which has changed dramatically over the years. And the other one was that I actually was involved in music and music video production for the huge German conglomerate run by Leo Kirch back in the 70s and 80s, before Will was born. But I certainly then studied before that with Milton Friedman, which is where I first learned that you had to look at both equity and efficiency. Everything else that you'll see from now on is really, I think, characterized and informed by that. Thanks, Will.
Thank you. I'm really honored to have David here. I've sometimes said that everything I've learned about copyright, I learned from David Safir, to which he replied, and believe me, there's a whole lot that's not worth learning. Myself, I was chief economist at Spotify for the best part of a decade, and then before that, on the rights holder side, chief economist at the PRS, and then author of Tarzan Economics. And if I can just hop, skip, and jump to the book very briefly, not to shamelessly plug the book, but a chapter in the book is called Self-Interest versus the Common Good, which sets a beautiful backdrop to not just this presentation, but also the whole government inquiry as well. It tells a wonderful story about a scandal involving the ITV show The Mint. If anyone back in 2006 came home drunk at night, you may have watched a show called The Mint, and how that was used to scam the blanket license they were paying the PRS, essentially scoop the pot. And that story is a very interesting backdrop to what we're going to discuss here as well. So please, in chapter 5 of that book, I think you'll find a wonderful backdrop to Paul Pacifico's idea, but also the inquiry as well. Is this AIM acting in our self-interest, or is this AIM acting for the common good of the business? We should also set some backdrop here, which is we're discussing one of 11 ways to fix streaming. Paul wrote a beautiful op-ed in Music Business Worldwide where he kind of laid out his vision here, which is important. But the work wouldn't have been possible without the help of Impala, and we thank them for joining the call. They've also got another 10-point plan that they're putting forward as well. So there's a lot of ideas coming from the independent sector. This is just one, and I would love the Q&A to sort of balance this option against others that Impala are considering as well. So how we're going to structure this, we're going to get you through this in about 15, 20 minutes. We're going to go fast. We're going to bring up all slides for Q&A, but we want to revisit the original paper, Money In, Money Out. I think that's critical, and get you up to speed on user-centric. We also have another paper called User-Centric Revisited, which is very mathematical. There's no maths in this presentation, but we are going to present the conclusion of that maths to you folks. Then we're going to discuss the application of progressive scales. How would you actually mathematically put in place this growth model? What does it look? And thanks to the Entertainment Retailers Association, when you actually map it on UK top 10,000 chart data, which is quite exciting. And I've tried to make that as simple as possible to follow. Any problems, stop the bus, and we'll go through it. And then finally, just some considerations about what does it mean to tax the very rich to help the less rich? Is this a solution for the market as well? So there'll be a lot of analogies you'll draw from taxation here, because taxation does essentially the same thing. So to our presentation, to stress, there's a lot of resources available that, and actually on the website tarzaneconomics.com, we put them all there as well. 4 papers published by Cersei, one looking at countries with more than one collecting society, Brazil, Turkey, America. 2, the splits between mechanical and performing rights, that's songwriter side, separate from AIM. 3, money in, money out, lessons from collective rights management organizations. This is where we can draw on what ASCAP, BMI, PRS have been doing for years that the music industry, the recorded music industry, is debating today. And then finally, the maths paper, User-Centric Revisited, if you are mathematically inclined, provides a framework for thinking about this debate as well. But the key is going to be this one, and this is a non-technical paper, and I really encourage folks to read it just to learn from what the collecting societies have been doing as we discuss how to allocate what is essentially a fixed pot of cash. It's a pretty easy parable to spot. So, first part is just to make sure everyone's up to speed on the pro-rata user-centric debates. Let's just explain it simply here. If you have the pro-rata model, remind ourselves what happens. Total streams of track A are divided by total streams for that period, for that market, times the total revenue generated by those streams for that market equals the revenue distributed to track A. It's a pooling model. We pool all the streams together, we pool all the cash together, and we allocate. Simple. If you get 1% of all the streams for that month in that country, you get 1% of all the cash. Now, user-centric, how does that work? User 1, let's say Sammy streams of track A, are divided by user 1, Sammy streams for that period, times what Sammy paid, which could have been a student plan, an organic 999, a family plan, interesting, allocation within the family plan, or a 3-for-1 trial, whatever that revenue was that Sammy produced, gets you to the revenue that Sammy will distribute to track A. That's the simple arithmetic of this debate, often gets lost in the discussions. Now to illustrate it with 2 users, perhaps David, do you want to walk us through this one?
Essentially, what we're trying to show here is that if there are 3 particular users, one of them streams 100 in a given period, and 25 of those streams are a particular track. The second one streams 1,000 out of 4,000 streams in a given month. I'm not sure what else they'd have time to do. And the other one, the last one, will actually believes it's not quite clear whether that person is alive or not, but they appear to have streamed twice in the month, and one of their streams was the track that we're talking about. Under the pro-rata system, they would simply aggregate those 25 of 100 plus the 1,000 of 4,000 plus the 1 of 2, and you would have a total of 4,102 streams, of which 25%, or almost exactly 25%, were of that single track. Under user-centric, you add up the proportions rather than the absolute number of streams, so that a quarter, in other words, 25 of 100, plus a quarter, 1,000 of 4,000, plus a half, 1 of 2, and you divide that obviously by the 3 particular users, and you actually find that that track earns 33%. So clearly, this is a very simple explanation of it. You would have to multiply this by so many times that it would actually lose any sense whatsoever. But we hope that this shows essentially the rather glaring differences between pure pro-rata and pure user-centric.
And for those who are mathematically inclined, there's an interesting observation that 33% is actually 25% more than 25% as well. So how do we wrap up the money in, money out paper? It's about speed, efficiency, cost, and quality. And there's a beautiful example here, which I'll draw from the Danish collecting society, CODA, where I went there as a chief economist of PRS to criticize their cost-to-income ratio, which is 25%. And at the PRS, we were boasting it was 10%. Hey, we are more efficient than you. Look, we have a lower cost-to-income ratio than you. And the chairman of CODA, himself a famous songwriter, said, we know what you do at the PRS. You lock and load of analogies and you pump the money out the door. I will take whatever it takes in terms of time, labor, resources, and money to make my distribution as fair as possible. So he was distributing less money because the cost-to-income ratio was higher, but it was a fairer distribution. PRS was distributing more money, but less fairer. And as one person once told me, I can give you fairness, I can give you efficiency, but I can't give you both. You know, both societies are entitled to their strategies, but there's a trade-off that you have to juggle with there. And that trade-off between pro-rata, which is arguably efficient, you get 1% of all the streams, you see 1% of all the money, versus user-centric, which is arguably fairer, but has a cost to it. Where do you stand on that trade-off would be a great way to move this conversation forward. So we've talked off chapter 1. Chapter 2 will be very quick because we're going to skip all the maths of the second paper and just bring you to the conclusion of what we did when we did the mathematical proof for this debate. So to kind of quote something that David Safir has told me too many times, there's too many variables and not enough equations with this discussion. But if we hop, skip, and jump the mathematics, David, just walk us through what the conclusion is around this user-centric pro-rata debate.
The conclusion is, as we show on the screen here, that, as you might have intuitively thought, under pro-rata, that an artist is less concerned with diversity because they really are all about volume. They simply prefer being on the platform whose users stream their music most, because that way they will get the bigger share of the poll. But under user-centric, artists are more likely to prefer a platform whose listeners exhibit less diversity and focus exclusively on one genre or one or two particular artists or labels. And that, of course, is not necessarily compatible with the goals of AIM or anybody else. So these are the very simple trade-offs, but this is actually based on entirely empirical conclusions. So this is an objective view supported by the mathematics.
And that's a pretty simple explanation of a complex problem. I'll try and make it even simpler. What you don't hear in the current streaming environment is artists talking to their fans like fan clubs. Maybe they should, maybe there's an argument for that, but it wouldn't be inconceivable to think of an artist under user-centric saying, hey, my new album's out this month, please don't stream anyone else's. And that would be against diversity, but for the benefit of the artist. Chapter 5 of my book, self-interest versus the common good. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but it's just interesting to think some of these anomalies with regards to the word diversity. Everyone has a different definition of diversity, which is ironic. But it's interesting to think about what user-centric would do when you move away from a model which is purely about volume, okay? So that takes us up to the pro-rata user-centric debate. And that's really important because Impala on this call, Impala helped fund this work. And I want to make sure that we pay attention to alternative models within the AIM community. And we'll take questions on that as well. Now we're going to move on to the progressive scales part. And just want to tee this up with some examples from history. On doing this work, you know, when we were like proposed, like, should we actually start to try and model this? You know, is there any validity to it? I was told by a real veteran of the business, somebody who taught me a lot when I moved to London in 2006. He said to me, collecting societies have always used scales. I'm telling you, the guy that does the music for Countryfile on the BBC is the highest earning member of the PRS. Interesting. Why? Because he does TV ident music. Why? Because TV idents are used all the time. They eat up the clock of a blanket license. Let's use different language here. They scoop the pot from a fixed pot of cash. Now, is it right for the person who does the music for Countryfile is the highest earning member of the PRS? You can disagree amongst yourselves about that point. Does anyone know their name? No. It's interesting in terms of how to allocate wealth. Some people get lucky. I know the person who does the music for the Sky News theme tune, that music is exploited every 15 minutes of every hour of every day in 47 licensed markets and then recouped back to the PRS. Well done, that person. They deserve to be congratulated. But is that a fair allocation of wealth? And that's what really encouraged me to take this project on with David in terms of PROs have used scales for over 100 years. Is there a role for scales to be used here? Now, in the Money In and Money Out paper, we have this paragraph where you actually see us talking about scales, and this is back in 2017, so long before the inquiry. David, just walk us through this paragraph, because it's not just scales that CMOs use.
No, as we say, not all streams are worth the same, and within PROs, some performances are genuinely more equal than others, because time of day, for example, factor means that a 3-minute performance on television prime time is obviously worth more. It has a far larger audience than a 3-minute performance at 2 a.m. To an inevitably, as we say, far smaller audience. But degressive scales, degressive, progressive, we'll come back to, but essentially scales for a moment, let's say, premiums and bonuses, that's two other devices, if you like, are used by PROs to ensure, respectively, in the case of scales, that the 500th performance of a station ID, as Will typically just referred to, is paid far less than any of the first 499. Otherwise, it may scoop the pool, and there are all sorts of other moral and practical and mathematical reasons why it shouldn't. The second point is that the 500th performance of a hit is paid much more, sometimes through a bonus, than any of the first 499. That's particularly true where societies are competing. It's very, very true in the United States, where essentially what ASCAP and BMI distribute is obviously compared, especially when you have co-writers, one belonging to one to the other, and they actually look at whether there's some sort of benefit in moving from one society to another. And that the first public performance, this is typical in Spain, for example, of a system called Primas. The first public performance of a work in a given medium, for example, a film theme, is compensated with a one-off bonus because it has attracted a larger audience and, of course, presumably more lucrative advertising on a commercial TV station to that licensee. So these are simply three examples we've tried to put in a very short paragraph of tools, if you like, or devices that are used, one of which is scales. The other two are also very common, particularly in European and North American societies.
Grand stuff. And it was nice to hear you refer to the Spanish collecting society. My Spanish mother-in-law reminds me that the Spanish collecting society is more hated than Franco. So there's a perception problem there. So how do we fix streaming? Let's get into the heart of the debate. This is the work that Paul has asked us to deliver. So let's deliver it now. Should we tax the very rich to help the less rich? That's the best way we can tee this debate up. And I'm not taking an opinion about this. I'm going to present the outputs of the work we were asked to deliver about this. But there is a very interesting cultural perception about this question, which I want to allude to first. And it relates to an example of taxing the very rich to help the less rich and how people respond to something which is as controversial as this. So let's look at Sweden. I've worked for a Swedish company for the best part of a decade, and America, where I spent most of my time working for a Swedish company. And when I explain how ASCAP would allocate, let's say, $100 million of radio money, I talk about the audio feature premium. So they have a way of allocating a fixed pot of cash, which is interesting. And by the way, extremely well explained on their website. The music industry could learn a lot from how good a job ASCAP does about educating, very loud and very clear compared to other people. So they have a premium credits model, which says, I've got 100 million of radio money. I'm going to pump it out the door pro rata, perhaps duration-based pro rata allocation, but I'm going to hold 20 million of that 100 back and make that a bonus payment for the best performing songs for that period. Now, when you explain that to Swedish people, they say, no, you're making the rich richer at the expense of the poor. You're giving Max Martin a bonus payment at the expense of poor writers who would receive more money. And when you explain that to American people, they say, go, you're incentivizing great songwriters to write great songs. The point is, it's their model. It's a not-for-profit membership governed collecting society. If you're not on the board, it's none of your business. But how culture affects the interpretation of a reallocation of wealth. I find this story fascinating. And if 100% track record of getting this response from Swedes up top, it's a bad, and getting this response from Americans at the bottom, it's good. So as you understand our work, please think about where you're coming from politically or culturally in your interpretation. Model inputs. This is the worst thing an economist can do, which is present model inputs, all too small on the screen to understand. Don't worry about that. We're going to zoom in a second. But I just want to say this is so easy to do that a 9-year-old can apply scales. I didn't think this model was workable theoretically. We've done it. We've built it. A 9-year-old can use it, and I've road tested that. You can now discuss the practicalities of it. There are 3 things that you need to adjust. The first is in the top corner, which is the numbers, the time period you want. We were given 4 months of data to work with. The second is the per stream, which we have there is 00430. You can adjust that. And the third is up there in the middle, which is the coefficient. So let's zoom in on that. Now the coefficients simply say, I'm going to take the streaming market, chop it into 10 deciles, and then apply coefficients to choose who I punish and who I reward. And as you go from the lowest decile to the top, in this hypothetical example, nobody is saying this is how you would do it in practice, but to illustrate how the scales would work, I'm going to punish the top 2. They're going to get 0.92 and 0.92 respectively, and benefit the next 4 with 1.2, 1.17, 1.12, 1.05. To repeat, take a market, chop it up into 10 chunks based on volume, punish the top 2 deciles, benefit the next 4, and leave the rest unchanged. That's all the next 4 charts are going to demonstrate is the outputs which come from that model. We may have lost some people along the way here, but trust me, That's all we're trying to do here. And we can take you through this again during Q&A. So let's just go through the outputs. The first one is to show a number of tracks. So this is how you break a market up into deciles. So they're all level on the left-hand scale, 10 chunks of 10 equally volume tracks. But then B, the number of streams to come from those deciles, where you can see number 10, scoops of pot. Lots of streams happen in the head of a distribution. Anyone spot a long tail curve here with those green bars? And then it goes down and down and down as you work your way to the first decile as well. So deciles reveal a heavy head and a long skinny tail. Remember, this is the only top 10,000. There's 60 million songs in a streaming service, 40 million of which get activated. So there's a lot more tracks which go beyond decile 1. Very simple again, you've got a long tail distribution. Great. Move on to output number 2. So now we look at the average revenue per track decile based around the status quo model in gray, and then you've got the artist growth model in green. And here you can see how the top 2 are punished. In those top 2 deciles, green is lower than gray, and how those next 4 benefit where green is higher than gray. So this is the average revenue per track decile after you impose the coefficients. So you get the allocation of wealth point. Tax the rich to help the less rich and leave everyone else unchanged. Third output, an accumulation. I call this a torso effect, which is this interesting, and then perhaps getting a bit too statsy here, but if you look at cumulative revenue on the status quo, which is the gray line, and the cumulative revenue of the AGM, and you think, I don't like stats, I was too hungover at university to even study that subject, but I get what he's trying to say. I'm going to fatten the body or grow the middle class. If you were to just do this on a blank piece of paper, you'd expect the green line to be fatter than the gray line, and that's exactly what happens. What's interesting with the model is change the coefficients, change the per stream, and you can change how much fatter that line becomes. So yes, you have fattened the long tail distribution, you've grown the middle class, essentially. And again, for those who have done a bit of taxation policy, you'll start to see resemblances here. Last output, and potentially the most controversial, is to do this by label share, which is that under this model, indies, which are bracketed in the all other category, benefit, Warner's would lose out, Sony would lose out, and UMG would benefit. Now, this could cause some knee-jerk reactions, but remember, not all indies gain. You know, if an indie artist has done really well and topped the charts, they would be punished under this model. It's worth remembering, you know, it's a fairly objective application of the scales, and not all months are the same. If you did this in December when Christmas tracks are #1, that leads to anomalies. If you did this in the summer season when streaming volumes are potentially lower, that would lead to anomalies as well. But just in this example where I've opted to tax the top 2, benefit the next 4, leave everyone else unchanged for this particular month, February of this year, this was the outputs of the model. One way of thinking about this, again, bringing it to street level as charts, you know, I've always said the top 40 was interesting because the gap between 41 and 40 is way bigger than 40 and 39. So how do you compete to get into the charts? And we've had that debate for decades. And this is maybe an example of saying, for those who are just outside the top 40, here's some wealth from those who are inside the top 40. Is it fair? You know, what is fair? Fair has got nothing to do with preference or envy, which often dominates debates about fairness. Fairness is a much more neutral subject. So I think we should have a robust Q&A about, would this model be fair? You are making one person worse off to make other people better off. Is that a fair conclusion to this work? And there's also some theory to practice questions I just wanted to flag up here too. First one, operational questions. These scales will need to be administered by a neutral body across all DSPs. Who would that be? The official charts company, perhaps? Moral questions. Scale's going to make some parties better off and others worse off. So how do you build consensus? You know, who's going to take the pay cut? And remember, it could be indie labels that take the pay cut, but in this case, you saw that Sony and Warner's lost out. Industry questions. Scales could apply to tracks, albums, or artists. So what's the tax base? I think this is a really important one which gets lost. How am I applying the scales? The only way that we could see it being done was on a track basis. But maybe some people go into this debate thinking we're going to roll it up and punish rich artists. No, it's got nothing to do with the artists. It's the tracks that happen to be in the charts that week. And finally, charts make visible popular and popular more visible. Remember, that's what charts are. So should scales affect charts? In Germany, you have a chart which is value-based. So albums that sell at a higher price will influence charts more than albums that sell at a lower price. should these scales affect sharps? There's 100 other questions, but these are 4 good ones to use as icebreakers. So raising as many questions as answers to the model. We will wrap up now and hand back to Sammy for a Q&A, but please think about this. Firstly, a great point that David Safir has always made to me, which is throughout all of this debate over the past 6 months, can somebody please raise their hand in the classroom and say, why is pro-rata unfair? It's a very interesting point he taught me, which was, has anybody actually pointed that out? Like, we want something different. Well, what's wrong with the present? User-centric raises an interesting question about less diversity, pros and cons to that. I haven't CMOs use scales for years. What I love about Paul's challenge here was we're doing something which has been applied for over 100 years by collecting studies. This is nothing new. And then finally, it's nice in theory, but perhaps trickier in practice as well. Let me hand back to Sammy, and I'll reiterate, I'll come off screen share now, but we're very happy to bring slides back for Q&A as well. Thanks, Sammy.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Will and David. We've actually already had a load of questions in. If you have questions fresh in your mind off the back of that, please pop them in the chat window. And I've also, my phone has been going from people that are watching, and I'm looking at an iPad, so bear with me. And I'm 7 months pregnant, and an hour and a half is a long old ask for a pregnant lady. So if I make a weird face, I either think it's gobbledygook or I'm getting kicked by a tiny foot in my rib cage. And I'll let you decide which one that is. So thank you guys. So I mean, loads and loads of questions here. First of all, just to touch very, very quickly on fairness. Obviously, they started this discussion saying, is this fair? You've asked yourself the question there, Will, is it fair? There's a lot of people here that this doesn't cover. I mean, let's just quickly get that out the bag, that this doesn't solve, and Paul, you mentioned it in your opening speech, this doesn't solve the things being asked for by songwriters or musicians. So we'll park that for a minute, because I'm sure we're going to come back to it looking at what I've got in the questions window. But in terms of fairness, this would also weight towards a successful artist who puts a new release out. It's still going to benefit them in the first however many streams. So can we talk a bit about the actual fairness of this? Where do you see the biggest challenges in terms of fairness in this?
Maybe David, if you want to take a lead here, because I think fairness needs context from who's used scales in the past and who's been proposing to use scales here.
Not to be too radical about this, but I've always thought that it's easier to define unfair than to define fair. If you say to somebody, if somebody says to you, it's not fair, you say, what's not fair? Well, it's not. And then it usually turns out that what they really mean is, I want what she's having, or I'm absolutely convinced that everybody's getting more than I am. Basically, fairness is perceived fairness. That's what we're dealing with here. And although it would be frankly almost impractical, virtually impossible to apply degressive or progressive scales, if you like, retrospectively, once you've seen that some of the people who actually benefited didn't actually need it. So we do accept that that's one of the practical problems. It's actually, when you think about it, particularly fair to expose everybody for the first million streams, whatever it may be, whatever coefficients you choose and so on, regardless of whether you know that they're ultimately going to turn out not to have needed that particular help. So I don't actually think that we should be put off by that. And I should also just point out that, of course, in the numbers that Will's just been showing us, we have 1.2 and 1.0 and then 0.92. Of course, some of those are progressive and some of those are degressive. A lot of people say, what the hell is degressive? It's very clear in France and Germany what they mean by degressive. It's very clear in Britain what we mean by progressive, as in progressive taxation. Degressive essentially means that you're paying more rather than taking more tax. You're actually allowing people to keep more at the first stages of whatever they're trying to achieve and their income. And that, of course, is all because of what Paul was saying at the beginning about trying to ensure sustainability. We basically want artists to grow to the point where they have what I've often called accelerated maturity, so they can then compete going forward. I think, Paul, that's essentially why we were so concerned to establish that there are both progressive and degressive.
I love listening to, I was just going to say, I love listening to, if any of the three of you are talking, I know I'm learning. I think that's absolutely right. I think Will touched on something really, really important in this, which is, you know, it's fairer, not fair in an absolute sense. And from an aim point of view, where this came from, I guess, was a values-based view of the market. You can tweak the market in all sorts of ways, as I say, to create different sets of winners and losers. This was an opportunity for us to say, what does fair mean to us in the context of our foundational values? So for us, it's really important that the market operates transparently. It's really important that it gives opportunity to a very broad and diverse array of participants, and that it doesn't end up in a kind of monopoly or over dominant situation. We want to see a broad and diverse market that will excite and drive consumption of music into the future.
And then just one very quick remark from me, and I'll hand back to Sammy, which is I'm hugely influenced by Kevin's sister when he taught me about looking at problems that need solving. You may have heard him talk about this on podcasts before, but it's a great mentality to apply in tech. And so when you say, does this add ER to the word fair and make it fairer, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And I guarantee you, I think there's 500 people on this call today, there'll be 500 different problems that need solving. If the problem you're trying to solve is transparency, well, this could make transparency trickier because now not all streams are worth the same. If the problem is trickle down, advocates of ER, well, this problem doesn't solve the trickle down dilemma that ER would solve. Is the problem an allocation of wealth? Well, maybe it has inroads there. And I could go through many other problems that need solving, but I just want to say for Sammy, the challenge you've got in moderating is people are going to be coming with questions with different problems they want to solve.
Which again, I think Paul tried to lay out at the start is, I've been writing about this subject for 10 years. I suspect it'll rage on for another 10 years, but I do think we're edging closer to some, at least a conversation on solutions, which is what this is designed to be. And I am going to ask some of the more challenging questions that I can see in the chat window, because I think they do need to be discussed. And I'm actually going to jump straight in with one from Horace, saying this model is just a case of rearranging the deck chairs. It doesn't make more of the revenue that labels receive available to performers, and it completely ignores non-featured artists. Can we discuss that a little?
I'm happy to start on that, if you like. Hi, Horace. Thank you for asking the question. Yes, you're absolutely right in the sense that this model doesn't address non-featured performers. I think also the other thing I would say is, we do have thoughts about that, and I look forward to picking up on some of those conversations that I know we started a while ago. In terms of moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic, I think that's a criticism that could be levied at all of the solutions that are being tabled, in the sense that they all look at a fixed pot and how to divide money from a fixed pot. So you are de facto moving deck chairs around with any of the application of solutions. My view, and I think the AIM view, is very simply that the problem we're trying to look at is the massive concentration of wealth in the head of the snake, and looking at how we push that to the middle market to support more niche and credible emerging artists. In terms of your other point, we are absolutely aligned that unfair terms in contracts need to be eradicated, and that none of the solutions being proposed in isolation will really work unless we make sure that the contractual relationships between artists and labels are fair and balanced. And I think that that's a complex area, because each individual artist has individual needs and individual priorities. Do they prioritize a big advance? Do they prioritize a higher back end payment? Depending on their needs and their stage of life, stage of career, all sorts of other factors will influence that. But I think we're aligned, actually.
Sorry, go on, man.
Just add a very quick remark there, which is the comment is absolutely fair, but it shouldn't be taken as a criticism of what Paul's done here. Paul's explored the costs and benefits, the incremental costs and the incremental benefits of rearranging this deck chairs in this particular way. And there's lots of other ways to rearrange deck chairs, but credit to Paul for exploring the cost and benefits of this one.
Just on rearranging the deck chairs, so there's, as I'm sure you can imagine, a lot of people, when they saw I was hosting this, got in touch with me before I was hosting this panel. And something that came up from a lot of people that got in touch with me is that this model has the assumption that catalogue artists are worth less, and it also perhaps assumes, in terms of fairness, that a lot of those catalogue artists would be recouped. They're not. Some people are relying on a current streaming revenue. Will catalogue artists lose out even further here? People that haven't made their millions, especially thinking of unrecouped, and that goes back to another issue that I know is very difficult for a lot of people is fairer deals in the first place. I mean, can we all agree on this call that actually for anything here to work, we do need fair deals in place in the first place? Because, or you know, Sony's move to cut off recoup to pay out on unrecouped artists that they've announced recently. We need that in order for any model to work here, for any artist to truly benefit. But this does assume that you'd be devaluing catalogue artists.
2 points here. One, depends how you apply the coefficients. Point one, which is that's in the control of the person who has a model that a 9-year-old can apply in terms of where you want to apply it. And then two, I did mention it depends on which month you apply it to will affect the outcome of who wins and who loses. I remember sitting in an official charts company meeting where they're discussing applying a scale on the popularity of George Michael's Last Christmas at Christmas time. So we didn't have Christmas songs at #1 during Christmas because they're always at #1. I was like, this is mad. It's Christmas time. We like Christmas songs. How can you punish success at Christmas time? But that is a discretion by a chart company to say, should we explore this option? So catalog can easily rise to the top of the charts during some periods and fall to the bottom of the charts during others. Nobody's saying anything about catalog. Catalog as a term, by the way, is completely unfit for purpose. That's a whole different discussion. And I would encourage people to look at a famous Imagine Dragons case study there to understand what we can do there. But just to remember, you know, I think the key point is Top of the Pops had a top 40. That would scoop the pot, and tracks 41 downwards would lose out because they weren't in the chart. This is kind of, I think what Paul's vision is, how can I allocate a bit of that wealth from the top 40 to those who are just outside? I think that's the simplest way I can see what Paul's vision is in terms of how you could apply these scales.
Yeah, just to add to that, I don't know in my mind that there's a differentiation between when a track is released. You know, there are a lot of very credible artists who have a passionate fan base, who are getting consistent, you know, revenue from streaming, but just not at the scale that tips them into the head of the snake. And I think this model would benefit many of those because I think it enables people in the middle market, more people in the middle market, to make a more substantial revenue from streaming than they do currently.
Could I just say that, as Will said in the presentation, we were looking at the torso effect, and obviously a very different shape of the body, if you like. But more importantly, today's niche artist is actually one day hopefully going to become a catalog artist. So we have to look at that as well. Essentially, we're trying to manage, or shall we say, more efficiently manage their revenue over a lifetime, over a career. And there is, after all, a collective responsibility. And of course, the other point is that the artist growth model does not pretend to answer every question, but it is quite possible to make it complement other solutions to other questions. They can work together and, in fact, empower each other. So
how do you see this? Sorry to put in it. So in terms of, we've covered a little bit of user-centric as well. And my issue with all the data that I've seen across user-centric so far is actually it's never been done across every platform for the same artist or a number of artists. And we know that people behave very differently on certain services, and we know that they actually behave differently on the same service sometimes. But the data that I have seen across, and included in some of your reports, which I read this week, and some of them really hurt my head, but some of them were much easier to understand than others. We know that some niche genres, for instance, benefit. We know that, we can see it across the data. We also know that there's been tests ran across Merlin data, AIM data, Deezer data, Spotify's SoundCloud have got their user-centric modeling out, and they're showing, I think it's 25% of artists on their platform are 60% better off. So if you actually want to put some figures around this, who is this going to benefit most? I know in your modeling, and Will and David, you should probably the far best place to answer this, but what are we saying in terms of what people are earning now versus what they could be earning? Like what level of artist is going to benefit here? Because if even in the quote, you know, not being able to earn until you've hit a certain streaming quota, that is a problem. And I know that that's in Impala's plan, I believe, there's something that needs addressing. Also, the duration of the track, you know, how much of the track is listened to before it pays out. But if you're an artist that's got, I don't know, 100,000 listeners a month, is this going to benefit you in any meaningful way? If you've got 1 million listeners a month, is this going to benefit you? Because back to Horace's point on, moving the deck chairs, fundamentally we're still reshuffling that pot. What kind of level of artist is going to benefit here, and what's realistic for people to take away?
David, if you want to take a lead, and I'll come back on user-centric afterwards.
Well, I think actually that if we go back, and we don't necessarily have to look at the tables and the charts, but if we go back to what we were trying to present about how we broke it into deciles and then tried to apply digressive at one point and then turn around eventually to become progressive, that really what we started out as testing, if you like, was how do you get somebody who has, I think, Paul, we said 1 million streams in a month. Is that right? To the point where they will earn what we considered would be a sustainable, enough, frankly, to keep them in the business. And obviously, there are all sorts of other variables there, all sorts of things you have to consider, such as, do you say over a month, or do you give them a year to get there? Do you actually do it by track, as Paul N will have said, by track, or do you do it by artist? Do you do it by label, and so on? So there are all sorts of ways, frankly, where you could bring in your own numbers, and they'd be very different for each territory, not just to mention for each genre in each territory. And obviously, you then have a different infrastructure in terms of how the money in becomes money out in each territory, the distribution rules and so on that are being applied. So I actually think the artist growth model should be seen more than anything as a model, literally, where you plug in, as I think we'll try to explain, as you plug in the numbers that you want to, and you say, if we were trying to, for example, ensure that somebody who had 100,000 streams over a period of 6 months actually got paid from the first stream, as you said, or actually earned a minimum amount of money, would we be able to do it with this alone? Would we be able to do it at all? Would, frankly, the costs of implementing this outweigh the benefits to anybody, let alone the individual artists we're considering? So I do think this is adaptable, and it should be seen very much as a model. For time, we very clearly did apply our figures to show one possible output, one possible outcome, if you like, which will then actually explain in terms of how it would even impact individual labels.
And then just from me, I think very interesting that you touched on user-centric, and Impala are on the call. We know what the first I in Impala stands for. Very interesting observation you made about local language. I have no doubt at all that local language repertoire will benefit under user-centric. Absolutely. People in Denmark who listen to Danish perform music will see more of their money go to Danish performing artists than before. But then we go back to what is fair, often driven by preference and envy. So what would user-centric benefit? Local language repertoire. It's a fixed pot of cash. Who loses? English language artists. So you see a reallocation away from British music export towards domestic talent. Now, I just stand back and say, is that fair? Is it fair that Canada has a quota saying you have to play Canadian music? That punishes other people who don't happen to be Canadian. Is that fair? So it's a very interesting way of thinking about fairness, is the local language aspect. There's two sides to every debate here.
There's 20 sides, Will. Let's not beat around the bush here.
There's a lot of equations, but it's very interesting to think from an Impala perspective. Great, you're serving local artists, but I can tell you right now that over 80% of the British artists on Spotify see the majority of their revenues come from overseas. For every one track at home, it's 4 overseas. That's a very successful export success story. It's something I'm passionate about. How would user-centric affect that? And should I be bothered? It leads to quite philosophical questions about fairness.
Well, in terms, just touching on international there, because obviously at the moment we're very much looking at the UK, although Impala have set out their stall, and as of many other people. But in terms of UK benefit and actually on an international level, one of the things that was not touched upon in this presentation, but I have read a lot about in terms of user-centric, is being able to battle fraud, which we know exists, and I've seen proof of it across independent and major labels, that it is rife. We know it's particularly rife across some genres. Does this model address anything to do with stopping fraudulent behavior on streaming services?
I'm cautioned against user-centric combating fraud, because fraud is a moving target. It wouldn't, for example, combat account hacking. There's a type of fraud that was exposed by a BBC in a wonderful piece of investigative journalism 2 years ago. In fact, it'd be worse under user-centric. I think the best way to tackle fraud is to reduce the time between identifying and tackling and take away the incentives. There's just two curveballs to throw into that debate, which is to think, abstract what fraud is and think, how do you reduce the time it takes to identify and tackle it? And how do you take away the incentives for it to occur in the first place? But also it can create more complexity into licensing, which could create more opportunities for fraud to appear. So fraud is a moving target. I don't think it's fair to say user-centric as a solution to fraud, but you're absolutely right. Fraud is an issue. It's like crime stats.
SoundCloud, I think, is one of the ones that have gone on record saying that they've been able to eradicate fraud across their service with user-centric input. So I understand it as a moving target. Does this model address in any way fraud prevention?
I think it indirectly, at best. I think it perhaps draws more attention to streaming behaviors, and that might be a good thing. But I can't see a direct link between this model and tackling fraud. The last point on fraud, it always reminds me of the golden rule of crime stats. When crime stats go up, three things happen. Either A, we're getting better at catching criminals, B, crime is actually on the up, or C, we change the definition of what crime is. How do you actually interpret fraud stats? If I say I've eradicated fraud from my platform, that might mean I've done a great job, or I've done a really bad job because I can no longer spot where it's taking place.
Just something so Annabella just from MMF in the Q&A things just said on fraud specifically, that the user-centric does take away incentive because you can't get out more than you put in as opposed to the pro-rata model. Anyway, we'll step off that. There's so many questions coming in that we're going to have to go to at some point. But just something else before I jump into the incoming questions here. So a lot of this as well has been positioned in terms of, you know, taxing the rich to pay the poor, and the champagne communist in me kind of thinks we all know that the richest of society and the biggest corporations don't fucking pay any tax. They never have, because they find the loopholes. So is the loopholes here surely will absolutely still exist, whether it is in the rate per stream, in the life of copyright. There's a lot of things here that we haven't covered that I think it is important for context, whether it's so many things. Is there?
I think it's easy to, I think this is a great example of how it's so easy for these conversations about streaming to suddenly become diffuse across a whole range of issues.
But we can't ignore the issues then.
No, and I'm not trying to duck any of the issues. I'm just saying it's an example of where we're moving into a conversation about, for example, contractual practice between artists and labels, or songwriters and publishers, rather than actually the problem we're trying to solve with the artist growth model, which is around diluting the huge concentration of wealth at the head of the tail for the benefit of the middle market. I think the thing, okay, so the positive that we're talking about today is that this is an idea that allows for more people in the market to make a sustainable living from streaming, which strikes me as one of the key problems being addressed in the DCMS Select Committee inquiry and in other debates about how to make streaming work better for more people. Okay. In terms of the contractual side and questions around life of copyright deals and royalty rates and those sort of things, I think we absolutely shouldn't shy away from those debates. I think AIM has a really clear and consistent kind of message around those things.
Can I ask you on that? Because it's been asked by 3 people, just because it's on point.
Great.
The Fair Digital Deals Declaration and Impala 10-point plan are positive statements by the indie sector. Does AIM have a view on what a fair minimum royalty rate would be? Without a benchmark, this could be anything and very unfair, and we know that deals are still different across the business. Can you wrap anything around that? I know it's difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. What I can say, it's probably an unhelpful answer, is to say it's difficult for us to put a number out there for 2 reasons. One is we've got to be quite careful around an area of competition law here in stating, fixing a market in that way. But the other is to say that AIM is a very, very broad and diverse community with very different types of businesses with very different types of business model. So, a fixed percentage from label A may represent a very different balance of fairness in a deal than a much higher percentage from label B. Equally, the headline percentage royalty rate is not the only indicator of value in a deal, both to the artist and the label. It's one of many factors. It's a very important factor, but it's one of many. You've got the advance. Also, we all know the Tom Waits quote that I love at the top of the Fair Digital Deals Declaration, the large print giveth and the small print taketh away. Let's be clear also about whether the headline royalty rate is actually what artists are getting. Is it what you see is what you get? Or do you have one page telling you what you're going to earn and 109 pages telling you why you're not going to earn it? These are areas that we can't shy away on, that we have to have discussions about. We're really clear on it. We're really clear that sharing non-attributable revenues, not making those kind of deductions that have no place in the digital economy, shouldn't be perpetuated in contracts. Contemporary contracts shouldn't reflect old world practices, and old world contracts that are not fit for purpose, we believe should be reviewed, and that should be
reviewed or should be changed.
It depends. It depends. It depends on the deal between the artist and the label. If an artist had a £10 million advance a few years ago, hasn't recouped, and had a life-changing sum of money, the label is still way out of pocket. Should the label be forced to adjust the contract in favor of the artist? Is that fair to the label? I think all of these things, we need to find where the balancing point is. One of the complexities to the debate is that individual artists have individual circumstances, and the individual contracts are negotiated to reflect that one-off deal. So it's difficult to have a one-size-fits-all solution other than to say we need to root out bad practice.
Agree. And again, I know that these are such, we could go off in so many tangents. I'm going to come back to the model for a moment, but I think it's important that we do answer some of the questions, because a lot of people are asking some of the same things. So back to the model for a minute. We've had a lot of questions, and I won't read them out individually, but to your point, Will, of Sony and Warner would potentially lose out on this model. There's a lot of people saying, well, why would the majors even buy into this? Which is an interesting question.
Yeah.
I'm having a lot of conversations where majors are warming to the idea of user-centric in some part. So can we look at, how difficult would that be to implement if they are going to lose out versus something like user-centric?
So building off that last dialogue you just had, what's interesting here is it's an option to explore, which is holistic. You had discussion just there about, I want a minimum royalty rate. That's one thing. And I'm always reminded about Goodhart's law, which is target one variable and all the other variables move in an opposite direction, which cancels out the purpose of that variable. What is a benefit from a methodological perspective here is it's a holistic proposal. Now, why would you get buy-in from people who are potentially lose out? Remember, it's just 1 month's period. There will be months where potentially indies could lose and majors could gain. It's variable, but I think the operational aspect is worth perhaps bringing to light here as well. Let's think how this would work as an operational project. Would Apple, Spotify, Amazon send all their data for that particular month, period one, to the official charts company, who would then aggregate it, apply the scales, send that back to the individual charts companies, who would then apply the scales and then pay the rights holders accordingly? I think it's worth just shoving that operational point in there. It's not impossible. It's definitely more complicated. Definitely takes up more time, but it's definitely not.
And would it be higher admin costs, which has again been something interesting out of user-centric in the data that I've seen, that actually we all assumed it would be more complicated, but the people implementing it are saying not so. It's costing them less to implement. So would this cost more than existing or other solutions?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to add a cost or add a layer of complexity to the process. There are lots of lawyers on this call, I know, and it might be interesting to go straight to them in terms of legally, how would this work? We had an antitrust issue there as well, which is you cannot have a recommended retail price. You would have to have this very neutral charge, antitrust compliant, saying, okay, I've got all your streaming data for the period of June 2021. Here's your scales. There you go, guys. Go pay it out to the artists and the labels now. It's that process, and I'm not a lawyer, does require some legal discussion in terms of the practicalities that would impose. And I'm just being very open and transparent there about, there's something here which is holistically being modeled. Now over to the lawyers to work out how that would work in practice.
And just on something else that's been modeled. So Crispin's asked about it in the chat, but it was on my list of questions to ask, and a number of people asked me to bring it up today. There's various people, and I think actually potentially even Impala, talking about splitting the way that we pay streams. So the push and pull argument, whether something's coming from playlist or whether a user is seeking out a track. And there's something I read in Music Ally this morning, but some distributors now, independent distributors, are seeing some success on their discovery mode on Spotify in paying out less per track. So the services themselves really are starting to position that as a different value. There's various calls for ER, equitable remuneration, to be applied across playlist plays, because it's acting more like radio. That would make some sense. And then put anything that a user directly pulls themselves, have either user-centric, or would this, that's my question, would this model work in that scenario if you separated out push and pull, so that we did apply ER across playlist plays or lean back plays? Would this model work for library direct or search or user pulling tracks?
Can I jump in quickly on that? Because I think whilst, you know, Will and David can give a much more accurate answer in terms of the economics of the piece, but I just think, first of all, I think just there you've hop, skipped and jumped over a whole bunch of different issues and complex
Very wary
areas.
of time, Paul. Very wary.
Good, thank you, Sammy. But the point is, you know, the complexity of implementing ER is one thing, the complexity of implementing user-centric is another, etc., etc. I like David's point earlier about the fact that the artist growth model is a model. You can apply the differentiated coefficients to distributions on any system you like, and the logic and the place that we came up with this from still applies. In other words, how do you help more people make a living? Now, as to whether ER should be applied or user-centric or other options that solve for different stakeholders' concerns about the market, I think is additional and separate to a conversation about whether this idea of using digressive and progressive scales in the artist growth model works to enable more people to make a living across the market.
But that's what I'm saying. Let's say it does. Let's say it does. Would it work? And just playing devil's advocate here, because this is a solution being suggested. Would it work sat alongside that model of two separate systems?
It could. The answer is yes, it could. You could literally layer scales on top of other distributional models. It could. There is nothing that, how do you say, negates other options sitting alongside this. But if I go back to what I said in my first answer, which is Kevin says from problems that need solving, if the problem you're trying to solve is transparency, then doing that would not solve the problem of transparency, because the ability to audit that you made £23,000 last quarter from streaming, was that £23,000 at source, or should it have been more? Has somebody ripped off and taken cream off my milk along the way? Becomes even more complicated. So I just want to come back to what problems does this audience want to solve? And if some of this audience, if 20% of this audience says, I came here to learn how to solve the problem of transparency, that would not solve it. And maybe just, you know, a colleague of mine at the PRS, Bruce Dickinson, not the Iron Maiden singer, once said to me, only 4 people on planet Earth understand how Gamer distributes money from Germany, and 2 of them don't work for Gamer, and 1 happens to be on this call. I believe that's wrong. More people should understand whether that Gamer royalty statement from Germany is correct or not. But it is so complex that there's a tiny number of people who know the detail. And I don't want the music industry to go down that path. That, you know, the current model, half a penny per stream, 1 million streams, 5,000, got a royalty at 20%, that's 1,000. I'm doing it in my head. There's a value to simplicity when transparency is a problem you're trying to solve. So
I think you're right. That's definitely one of the reservations I've got about user-centric, is the potential pricing volatility of streams, because the price could vary wildly depending on the listener's habit, and artists and labels have got no way to anticipate what that might be. At the moment, you can plan ahead knowing that, as Will just said, you know, 1 million streams is roughly 5,000. So you can think, well, if we're reaching those kind of numbers, we know what kind of revenue we're going to get. With user-centric, month by month, the same number of monthly streams could lead to very wildly varying outcomes for income.
But would that necessarily?
That would happen here, Sammy. That would happen here as well.
To a lesser degree.
If I can quote Alison Wenham, Paul's predecessor, and I've quoted her in 7 different languages, when she stood up on stage at a CSAC conference once in 2007, and she said, collective licensing is capitalism with a touch of communism, or communism with a touch of capitalism. What this is doing here, and what many of the options being explored are, is how do you introduce capitalism to communism? Remember, we are entering our 20th year of the $9.99 price point. Okay, so the way that current model works is like a model of communism. Paul McCartney gets half a penny, Joe Bloggs gets half a penny. That's good. It's got lots of benefits. But once you start altering where not all streams are worth the same, you do open up a whole can of worms of issues, many of which are manageable. And to David's point, collecting societies have been treating all streams differently, or all songs differently, for over 100 years.
But I just
Even-
to go
Go
back
on.
to your point, Sammy, you said, could this work alongside some of the other concepts, some of the other devices? The answer is not only could it already does, and that I mean, of course, in the context of PROs, it already does work. Not only that, but they very carefully adjust pretty much, I'd say, every 3 months, every 6 months, to make sure that it continues to work and that these things can actually work together rather than one overwhelming the other and actually negating the benefits that you were getting from one of the other vehicles or one of the other processes that you were using. But I also think that, if I can just refer back quickly to money in, money out, one thing I was told when I first joined ASCAP by my very esteemed boss, who I hope is watching today, is that if you're talking about money in, you need a lawyer. If you're talking about money out, you need an economist. And if you're talking about money in transit, you need a detective. And basically, that's how we understand how to make the business transparent, how to understand how we convey that what somebody may perceive is unfair is not necessarily unfair, or frankly, is fair to you, but it's unfair to somebody else. You know, you actually do have to balance equity and efficiency. You also have to be fair to everybody, or as fair as possible, as equally fair, if I can put it that way, as you can.
Isn't that's, I mean, I don't need to tell anyone on this call, that's the issue we're having here, is everyone is going to be a winner and a loser to some degree, no matter what we implement here. And there's almost a lack of understanding or willingness to accept that. Like, it's always really annoyed me that our industry doesn't sit around a table and go, all right, do you know what, yeah, I'll give you a bit of that, but can we have a bit of this? That there's a real lack of that at the moment. And I've got some of the questions in thing, I'm wary on time, and I think we can probably run over a little bit, but I just want to go, there's a question from David Martin at the FAC. Much of the frustration is that the industry continues to speak in the abstract about such things as royalty rates. It remains one of perhaps the largest problem that the industry continues to battle around with streaming. Isn't it monopolistic to suggest that all labels can and should offer a digital royalty rate of X as a bare minimum? Some of the more artist-friendly labels are already doing this successfully. If this model, even this model, requires a fair digital royalty rate, and is AIM got any ideas on what that should be?
I think, I mean, we sort of covered this earlier. I'm absolutely of the view that, you know, royalty rates should be as much as they can be, bearing in mind the other factors in the contract. I think Will put it very well. If you're fixated just on the royalty rate, there are many other factors in the contract that can shift against you. I think any contract between any creative person and their commercial partners, whether that's a songwriter and their publisher, an artist and their label, or whatever it might be, I think has to be reflective of the relationship they're entering into, and it has to achieve balance. And I think there's a very important role there for managers, for lawyers, and the other stakeholders in the industry that support people when they're going through those negotiations to try and land that in a better place. And from my point of view, I talked about this in another context recently, but drink driving didn't stop because it became illegal. Drink driving stopped because it became socially unacceptable. And if you were in the pub with your mates and you said, oh, I've had a few, I'm going to have one more for the road, people started to go, whoa, what are you doing? And I think our industry needs to transition to a place where unfair, bad faith practice becomes socially unacceptable in our industry, in contracts and in other areas.
Playing devil's advocate, well, haven't we tried that? And actually, the reason that the select committees ended up where it is because the industry doesn't bloody listen to moral values, and sometimes it needs a bit of structure and potentially legislation. And I'm actually not going to let you answer that because I want to get through a couple more things. I apologize, we'll answer it later. Maybe on Twitter, we're always quite entertaining there. Martin Mills would like to know, in this version of the model, can you tell us how much more an artist doing 500k streams would make?
500k more.
Can I take that one afterwards and actually provide the answer to Martin with accuracy? And just to preface it by saying it depends what the coefficients are, and of course it also depends on the month that you apply it to. But I'll provide a simple arithmetic example that you guys can share with all your stakeholders on that question.
I think
great question from Great Economist.
It's great though, because you can look at this problem with the artist growth model from both ends of the telescope. You can say, what is the level that we think somebody should be earning a living from streaming, and adjust the model to get to that place. Or you can say, what is the most taxation we think the top of the tail of the top of the snake can bear, and therefore what's the maximum coefficient we're prepared to apply? Yeah, you can look at it from both points of view. Go on.
And also just another third point of view as well, to get completely schizophrenic here, is to do what ASCAP does, which is to reward success. If you wanted to, you could punish failure and reward success and give the top songs even more money, if you're that way inclined.
Let's not do that just yet, shall we?
I'm watching all these vegetables getting thrown at me here, so I'll park that one and yeah, go back to Sammy in the moderating chair.
I don't want to throw any more vegetables, but this question is quite interesting. So from Shannon says, this is a really interesting model, but I can see some people saying it's not enough. You're still only helping successful performers by targeting the third and fourth deciles. Did you explore a model where the coefficients are greater than 1 for the very bottom?
Speaking for myself, when the guy sent me the model and it just had those blue cells that you can change, and it's like, as Will said, even a 9-year-old can drive that particular model. I must confess, I sat up late one night with a glass of wine and I pushed and pulled it around and I put in crazy numbers to see what would happen. And sure enough, on that graph where you see the middle market start to get a bit thicker, you can really push that out. You know, it can look like a pregnant anaconda, you know, if you want it to, you can push and pull it around. And I think this is, I would say this is chapter 2 in this conversation. Chapter 1 was, I got this weird idea, and the idea, for me, the idea came out of thinking about compression, how we apply compression in the studio in music, where you've got songs that you're recording where the highs are too loud and the lows are too quiet. You apply compression in the studio or on stage to even that out, to smooth those spikes and make it more consistent. The artist growth model, from my point of view, came out of that. And when I came to Will and said, am I mad? Could something happen here? That was chapter 1. Chapter 2 was then developing that into a working model with real world data behind it to see what actually happens. And that's where we are today. And I think what I'm hoping is that we can move through chapter 2 into chapters 3 and 4. I would love other stakeholders to come to the table with the kind of data and resource that would allow us to test it against on a per artist basis, on a per label basis, all these other sort of permutations that we could explore to figure out what might work best. Can we make fairer even fairer? You know, how far can we take this and how well can it work? That's there to be explored.
Do we not argue that we need that across all models? And again, one of my biggest frustrations for years has been that we haven't seen that for all models. We haven't seen robust testing. Then all the data that has been shown has been behind closed doors, often labels not sharing the results with artists or managers, which is fucked, quite frankly. But we do need to look at that side of this across all models for buy-in across any of these, because otherwise we're all pitching in the dark a little bit. You know, we can suggest a million things, but if we don't have the data to back it up and understand the full implication across platform, across artist, across genre, then perhaps it doesn't work. And just quickly, there's a couple more on the model in terms of the majors, but I'd quite like to know, what has the reception for this been like? From AIM members, it'd be interesting to understand from what it's been like from a label perspective. Has this in any way been discussed or put forward to the major labels? I know, Paul, you submitted it as part of the select committee for the inquiry. And also, has there been any discussions with the DSPs around this model? Because we know that some of us have always said, we don't care what model you want to use because we're going to pay out the same amount of money, so stop trying to involve us in these discussions. Is that fair? But have you had any reaction from the DSPs and the majors directly?
It's really early stage. Like I say, this is chapter 2. We've just got the model. We're just starting to introduce it to the world properly. And this call is very much about doing that in a super transparent way, to say, here's where we are on this. It's not this huge reveal, look, we've solved streaming. It's like, we're having a conversation internally and we'd like to involve as wide a spectrum of stakeholders in that conversation as possible, and to be really clear about our thinking here and where we're coming from. I think, Sammy, I loved hearing you say that, you know, it'd be great to see more ideas come to the table with more data underpinning them. I wish AIM had the kind of resources to have, like, you know, a research team, a data team, and that kind of thing, maybe in the future. But I would love to see more industry stakeholders come to the table with a willingness to provide data, to provide access to expertise. It's very unusual for AIM to have been able to take take the benefit of the expertise of people like David and Will. I mean, this is a real privilege for us, and we don't want to waste that opportunity to make it count. And for us, this helps in the aspects that we've described, doesn't try and fix everything. And it's an early stage in the conversation. So will people be nervous about it? Sure, change makes people nervous. As soon as you change the model from where it is today, you're going to have different sets of winners and losers, and people are immediately going to be starting to game out, do I win, do I lose, where am I in this? I don't think it's as straightforward as majors versus indies. In fact, I think that's way overly simplistic, because not only
that's not what I was saying. So I totally
agree.
No,
but
it's more, have there been any initial discussions with the
there have been, no, not directly actually at this stage. I've sort of just gently mentioned it around the trade association landscape at this stage, and I think the sensitivity in this moment, where we are waiting for this DCMS Select Committee report. The IPO are doing some very important research into creators' earnings. There's a lot going on right now, and I think there's huge nervousness. And my fear is that people are very fixed on a particular solution they're advocating for, and different people are advocating for different solutions. And whether that's based on data or emotion is different for different people. But my fear is that there's too much lobbying going on and not enough kind of discussion and analysis. And my hope is we can do a bit more discussion and analysis.
Oh, if you muted there, but sorry, I missed you there, Paul. You muted right at the end for me. Will, please go.
Yeah, it's just three closing remarks myself. One, this, regardless of what you think of it, is a huge win for the inquiry. The fact that we've actually done holistic research, not SoundCloud said, I ran the numbers on SoundCloud and the world looks like this. In your part of the world, this is holistic. This is the entire, all streams for 1 month in one country analysis. And that's, regardless whether you like it or hate it, that's massive. Two, on simplicity, that 9-year-old who played with the model, who, by the way, she recently got her Rhodium Maths Medal, the highest level of maths you can do in England and Wales at the age of 9. She worked out that the 9th decile was unfairly punished. So it's that simple. So you should just hit the top decile, but avoid everyone else. That was her conclusion. And then 3, last remark for myself is simply, I go back to the taxation rule, and I tried this with a lawyer yesterday, which is, if you think about the personal allowance in tax, which I think is around about £13,000, the government's saying you can earn 13,000, Sammy, before you matter, but under that level, you don't matter. My worry with the streaming economy is too many people, too many artists are sitting in that personal allowance. They just don't matter. They're not making meaningful income. So as a means to an end, exploring ways which you can get more people out of the personal allowance into making money that matters, as opposed to not mattering, is a good thing. That's kind of like my subjective point. I mean, I go back to a fifth of a fifth rule. 1 million streams, £5,000, 20% royalty, £1,000 to the artist, 4 members in a band plus a manager, that's £200 each before tax. That's not meaningful. Now, it's not doesn't mean it's right or wrong, but how do I get more people up that curve as opposed to stuck in a meaningless amount? How many artists get paid meaningless amounts from streaming services? That number would be a staggering one to calculate.
And just on, so because we are going to have to round this up shortly. There's so many questions we didn't get to answer, but you had a really good go at the ones that we did. But there's
please let me promise, me and David will strive to answer all of them within a sort of 24-hour period. We can work out a way of doing that, so we don't leave any stone unturned. So a pledge to the audience, we'll try and get to as many as possible.
Thank you. And that's the other question that's been asked by like 1 million people is, will you be making this presentation available anywhere? The deck slides.
For Paul to answer, it's his work.
Oh, I mean, well, for you to answer from an AIM point of view, I would love to make that happen if Will and David are comfortable with those slides. We can make them available on the AIM website, no problem.
Yeah, the data, I think we have to be respectful of the Entertainment Retail Association who helped us with that, but as much as possible to make available. I would love it to be a pocket calculator for everyone to play around with.
There's a lot of people
the working model, it would be really interesting to see whether we could get that out for people to play with. Maybe we'll have a separate conversation about whether that's feasible and how that might be.
Lovely. And just finally, but unless anyone's got anything else to say, I'm really intrigued. Obviously, this is the start of a conversation, and I really hope that people feel that we've asked a lot of questions here, because it's not you said at the start, it's not a silver bullet. There is no silver bullet. There is no silver bullet, but there's a combination of things that we can probably do to make our industry a fairer place. But where do you see this conversation going next? Where do you want this to go next? What's the ambition, not just for this project, but I think for the conversation widely?
I would love to see this modeled, further alongside some of the other proposals that are on the table. And we as an industry need to start forming a view around if we're going to change from the current system, what are the costs and benefits of each proposed change? What are the impacts? Who are the winners and losers? And therefore, which one do we think edges ahead, and which actually should we all collectively get behind? And I think before we do that, we should all read chapter 5 of Tarzan Economics and remind ourselves about the trade-offs between individual outcomes and the collective good.
And in terms of methodology,
also suggest that a lot of people have said that there should be more roundtables, there should be more communication. Let's work on this together. One of the most important, I think, dialogues that needs to take place and become more intensive is between labels and publishers, between CMOs on the one hand, and you could say neighboring rights societies in that sort of general sense, and very importantly on an international scale as well. Because I'm just fascinated, and I don't want to distract you from what we've been discussing about fairness, but I'm just fascinated by the fact that this morning one of the big talking points is the AMFA, American Music Fairness Act, that's now being introduced, or they're going to try and introduce. That fairness is all about a totally different subject. Yeah. So in the United States, as far as they're concerned, the people who are putting this bill, fairness is all about being paid for analog, for tracks that are actually broadcast on analog radio in the US, which they're not at the moment. And that, of course, has huge implications how that plays out for what we're talking about this morning. So this has to be a global discussion, quite honestly. And there are many organizations, including CSAC, obviously, which are very capable of bringing that together and facilitating that. But it also needs to be shared intelligence between CMOs on the one hand and neighboring rights societies on the other. I was told many years ago at PRS that the right to equitable remuneration is the scraps from the table for people who can't get hold of authors' rights. Now, if you think about that in the context of what people are advocating with ER now, and what Paul has, I think, written about whether ER is actually a compensation, it's not really remuneration, it's not really equitable, and so on, we have to have that discussion. Most people in the industry don't know the difference between, frankly, authors' rights and neighboring rights, let alone anything else. And they deserve to know so they can then genuinely address the questions and frankly look at the models that we've suggested from an informed point of view.
And last point from me, they also deserve to know that it's a fixed pot of cash. If you look at some of the coverage in Music Ally today and some of Stuart Dredge's brilliant journalism, we've got to get away from thinking this is a world where my actions on a streaming platform will make somebody buy 5 CDs at the counter instead of 3. Doesn't happen. It's a fixed pot of cash, and it's how you allocate that fixed pot of cash. But I do think a lot of people have come to this debate thinking we're back in the world of Tower Records in Glasgow, where you bought more CDs because of promotional activity and more money entered the market. It's not that world. So I think that's a really, really important consideration to keep in mind.
And that's a whole other panel for the further monetization of fan bases. But I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. But thank you so much, all of you, for being so open. Thank you for presenting this model. And I hope everyone that's been watching will be able to take away something from this. There will be stuff available. Will and David kindly said they will try and answer a lot of these questions in here.
Yeah, please log those questions.
Let's capture the questions and let's speak afterwards about how we can contribute to a shared doc or something to get as many responses, because I think some of them also will be for AIM to answer as well, but let's absolutely make sure that for our part, at least, we keep this kind of conversation going, this kind of, informed and, respectful dialogue that I hope will lead our industry to a more aligned and better view on what the future could look like for us all.
Let's hope so.
And thank you, all of you. Okay, Sammy, thank you very much for moderating probably the hardest panel of the year, I think. We've been bombarded by questions, brilliantly moderated. And Will and David, thank you for your work in this. It's been really excellent and very beneficial. Thanks to everyone that's watched, and do get in touch if you'd like to follow up on any of the points. Cheers.